Well, this morning, we're going to start a new series, and the series is going to take us 3 weeks through Psalm 77. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Psalm 77, or power up your device to Psalm 77 if you're using a device. And we're going to spend 3 weeks walking through this psalm. I've entitled the message, Frustrated by God. That's the title of the series. Because that's what this psalm is all about. This is what we would call a psalm of lament. Now, what's a psalm of lament? Well, a psalm of lament is when the psalmist, the writer, brutally, honestly shares what he's feeling about God. That's a psalm of lament. And by the way, about a third of all the psalms, there's 150 psalms, about a third of them are psalms of lament, where the psalmist is just being brutally honest with God about his feelings, about what's going on in his life. Now, this is a psalmist. It's not David, by the way. It's another man. We'll talk about him in a second, who's writing this. This is a psalmist who has had some difficult things happen in his life. And more than likely, his frustration at first was geared toward other people or to circumstances. But that's all changed now. It's obvious from the text that his frustration is targeting God. That's who he's frustrated with. He is frustrated with God and God's seeming inactivity in the problem of his life. And in this psalm, he's just being brutally honest with God. He's going to share it raw and unfiltered. And I think this is important, and here's why. Because I think, as we'll see, the first step in dealing with your frustration with God is to be honest with God. God doesn't want to hear what you think he wants to hear. He wants to hear what you're really feeling. And I love that God allows these kind of psalms in the Bible to show us it's okay to be honest with God. Because, folks, we've all been there. We've all been there at times in our life when we were frustrated with what seemed like God's inactivity during a problem time of our life. Chances are good that many of you listening to me right now, wherever you're at, are frustrated right now with God. You may have put on a nice facade when you came to church, or you may have sang the songs like everything was okay, but you know deep in your heart you are frustrated with God. And chances are almost perfect that all of us will face a time in the future when we become frustrated with God. And so the psalmist is going to be honest with God. When you think about the times in your life when you were frustrated, and there wasn't just a quick, simple fix to your problem, what was it that could make you feel a little bit better? And more than likely it was this. When you found someone in your life who would simply listen. They would just listen. And you could, in a raw, unfiltered way, pour out your feelings, and they would simply listen. Truth of the matter is, we're not very good at that today, are we? No, we're not. I remember when I was in Bible college, and I was a pastoral ministries major, and you had to pick a minor, and so I picked counseling, thinking that would be very advantageous to me becoming a pastor. And I told you this before. I took one counseling course and was bored to tears. And so as soon as that course was done, I went to the registrar's office and I switched my minor from counseling to Greek. You may not want to come to me for counseling, okay? But I do remember one thing that was said in that intro to counseling class when the professor made this statement. He said many times, the most effective counseling sessions are the ones where the counselor says very little. Because there is value in listening. We're not good at that. You see, when people come to us and they're frustrated with God and they begin to pour out their feelings to us, their heart to us, in an unfiltered, almost brutal, raw way, we tend to have one of three responses. Sometimes we just echo back some religious cliche. Well, just trust God, brother. God's got this. And I don't know about you, but in the times in my life when I'm greatly frustrated, especially when the frustration is toward God and someone just glibly gives me a religious cliche, I just want to look at them and say, get out of my face. Why can't we just listen? Sometimes we go into fix-it mode. And they're not even halfway through their story. And we're already rattling off what they need to do to fix the problem. And they're thinking, if it was that easy, I wouldn't be frustrated. And sometimes we can't just listen because we feel like we have to immediately begin to correct all their theological inaccuracies in what they're saying. And you know what I've discovered? When someone's really frustrated, we're going to see this in this psalm, they're going to say things that really aren't always theologically correct. Do you realize that? And yes, there comes a time when we need to correct that thinking, but sometimes it's not right at the beginning. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen. Just listen. About 15 years ago, I was talking to a pastor, a famous pastor. If I told you his name, you'd know him. And we were talking about effective preaching. And he challenged me to do something. And I've done it most Sundays since. He challenged me to take a 3x5 card. And I do this every Sunday morning. Sunday morning, I get in about 5:30 to the office. And the first thing I do is I pull out a card. And on the card, he said, write down the answer to this question. If you had to preach your sermon in one simple statement, not a run-on statement, one simple statement, what would it be? I know some of you are thinking, if you do that every week, why do you preach for 40 minutes? Just read the card and close in prayer. But anyway, and he said, then do your best to repeat that statement 6 times in your sermon. And I've done this most Sundays since then. I did it this morning. As soon as I got in the office this morning, I grabbed a cup of coffee. I sat down at my desk. I pulled out a 3x5 card. Been thinking about what my statement would be all week, and I wrote down this statement. Here's my statement for today. This will be the first time I say it. You can count and see if I get 6 by the end. The statement is this. You will never find a better listener than God is. You will never find a better listener than God is. You know what Psalm 77 is? It's God listening as this psalmist, in a raw, unfiltered way, even with theological inaccuracies, pours out his lament to God. Well, before we get to the actual text, let me give you a couple of interesting introduction points. Because if you're looking at your Bible, above verse number 1, there's a prescript that says that this was a psalm written to the chief musician and written in order of Jeduthun, according to Jeduthun. So let's talk about that for a second. The word chief musician can also be translated director of music. This was a psalm written for the director of music, the one who was in charge of worship in the temple in the Old Testament. By the way, that appears in 55 psalms. 55 psalms were designated as the hymnal, I guess you could say, for Old Testament worship. You can also find, by the way, that designation in Habakkuk chapter 3. Jeduthun was one of the individuals in the Old Testament under King David who was given the task of leading worship in the temple. He's also mentioned in Psalm 39 and mentioned in Psalm 62. Look at 1 Chronicles 16 and we see where he was first selected. It says he left Zadok the priest and his relatives, the priest before the tabernacle of the Lord in the high place, which was at Gibeon, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of burnt offering continually morning and evening, even according to all that's written in the law of the Lord, which he commanded Israel. Now, if you ever wondered what a run-on sentence is, that's it right there. Keep reading. With them were, and he names two men, Heman and Jeduthun. Doesn't it sound like superheroes? He-Man and Jeduthun. And the rest who were chosen, who were designated by name to do what? To give thanks to the Lord because his loving kindness is everlasting. I find this remarkable. This psalm of lament, this psalm where the first 10 verses are going to be dark. The first 10 verses is going to be this psalm is saying, God, you've let me down. You've changed. In fact, he's going to say in the first 10 verses, God, when I think about you, I get sick to my stomach. That's raw, isn't it? That's unfiltered. And it was written as a psalm to be used in worship in the temple. We don't sing worship songs like that today. Those type of words, they're not worship songs, they're country songs. There's a big difference there. But I love the fact that in the Old Testament, it was about being real. Worship isn't a facade you put on. Worship is when you're real. This psalm was written by a man named Asaph. Asaph wrote about 12 of the Psalms. Pretty much all of them Psalms of lament. Who was Asaph? Well, he was also one of the singers. He was part of the Old Testament worship, 1 Chronicles 15:19. So the singers, Heman, Asaph, and Ethan were appointed to sound aloud cymbals of bronze. In 1 Chronicles 16:7, then on that day, David first assigned Asaph and his relatives to give thanks to the Lord. This was a psalm used in worship. You know why? Because if we're going to be honest, there are many Sundays we come to church, and though we put on a facade, the truth is inside we're a mess. Worship isn't the facade. Worship stems from the mess. Asaph writes the Psalm of Lament, unfiltered, raw, almost brutal. And you know why he can do it? You know why it helps? Because you will never find a better listener than God is. And the first step in dealing with your frustration with God is to be honest with God. Because God doesn't want you to tell him what you think he wants to hear. He wants you to tell him what is coming honestly from your heart. So let me read the first 10 verses. I'll make some comments along the way. And then we'll go back and hit some highlights, or I guess we really could call them lowlights. Because these first 10 verses are dark. These first 10 verses just are depression, anguish, misery. And according to the psalmist, it's all God's fault. So let me read starting at verse 1. Asaph writes, my voice rises to God and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. In the night my hand was stretched out without weariness. In other words, I never stopped. My soul refused to be comforted. So we're off to a good start. Because in verses 1 and 2, what's he saying? There is a major issue in my life. There is a trial. There is a trouble in my life. So what am I doing? I am going to God. I am doing what I was taught to do in Sunday school. I am doing what they taught me to do in Bible college. I'm doing what the pastor always told me to do in his sermons. There's a trial in my life, so I am crying out to God nonstop. We're off to a good start. Because you'll never find a better listener than God is. However, it doesn't result in what Asaph thinks it should result in. Not only does there not appear to be any change in his circumstances, but it appears that God isn't even listening. And after a while of crying out and crying out and crying out, this psalmist has gotten frustrated. He's no longer frustrated at his trouble and his trial and his circumstances. He is now frustrated at his God. Have you ever been there? Look at what it says in verse 3. This is tough. When I remember God, when I think about God, after I've been crying out and crying out and crying out, nothing's happened. He seems to be ignoring me. He doesn't even seem to be listening to me. And now whenever I think about God, I am disturbed. When I think about God, I sigh. When I think about God, my spirit grows faint. When I think about God, I get a knot in my stomach. Have you ever been so frustrated with someone, so angry with someone, that just having someone mention their name causes your stomach to just turn into a knot? Seeing their post on Facebook just fills you with anger. That's where Asaph is whenever someone brings up the name of God. This is raw. This is unfiltered. And by the way, verse 3 ends with the word Selah, which is a musical word. It simply means pause. Pause and ponder. Pause and think about that. Can you imagine Asaph saying that? Look what else he says, verse 4. You, God, you've held my eyelids open. I'm so troubled I cannot speak. God, I cannot sleep, and it's your fault. Can't you at least let me get a little bit of rest? And I've had to close off myself from everyone around me because I am so in anguish I can't even speak, and it's all your fault, God. It's all your fault. Verse 5. I considered the days of old, the years of long ago, the good old days. You know, God, back when you used to hear my prayers, back when you actually cared about me, back when you were involved in my life and answered my prayers. I think back to those days. I remember because back in those days, I had a song in the night. I was filled with joy. I don't have that joy anymore, God. I meditated with my heart, my spirit pondered on you back then because you were so real in my life. But God, you've changed. I'm doing my part. You're not doing your part. And I'm frustrated. And then in verse 7, he begins to ask questions. And the questions are filled with theological inaccuracies. But he's being raw. He's being honest. Look what he asks. Will the Lord reject me forever? And I imagine that Asaph in his head's going, God, I know you don't reject us, but in my heart, it sure feels like you've rejected me. And is it going to feel like this forever? Have you ever been there with God? Will God never be favorable again? Oh God, I know in my head you show favor on your people, but it sure doesn't feel like in my heart you're showing any favor to me. Is that how it's going to be the rest of my life? Has his loving kindness ceased forever? Oh God, I know your loving kindness never ends. My head knows that, but in my heart it sure doesn't feel like you're loving me. It sure doesn't feel like you're being kind to me. Has his promise come to an end forever? Oh God, I know in my head you keep your promises, but in my heart it sure feels like you're not keeping them anymore in my life. Is that what it's going to be like forever, God? Is that my state from here on out? Look at verse 9. Is the problem that God has forgotten to be gracious? Is that the problem? Oh God, I know you're gracious. My head knows that, but it doesn't feel like you're being gracious to me. Is the problem, God, that you have forgotten me? Is that the problem? Have you forgotten that I exist? Have you ever been there? Or has he in anger withdrawn his compassion? God, maybe the problem isn't you've forgotten me. Maybe the problem is you're ticked at me. And you're so angry at me, you refuse to show me any more compassion. Is that the deal, God? Is that why you seem to be absent in my life? And then he adds again that word, Selah. Stop and think about that. This is raw. This is unfiltered. This is honest. But I really do believe the first step in dealing with your frustration with God is to be honest with God. And you will never find a better listener than God is. But then verse 10 is the climax. Here's his conclusion. Then I said, up until through verse 9, he was talking to God. Now he's just saying, here's my conclusion. It is my grief, it is my misery that the right hand of the Most High has changed. You know what the psalmist is saying? I've come to this conclusion. God, you've changed. You are not the same God you used to be. You used to be loving, you're not anymore. You used to be gracious, you're not anymore. You used to be compassionate, you're not anymore. And you must have chosen to let me live in misery the rest of my life. How's that for a worship song to sing on Sunday morning? But ladies and gentlemen, the first step, it's not the only step. We'll see more steps in the weeks ahead, but the first step in dealing with your frustration with God is to be honest with God. And I love that God includes these Psalms in the Bible to show us that even though we may all put on masks when we come to church, the truth is we know that most of us come to church messed up. And the first step is to be honest with God. And you will never find a better listener than God is. Well, let me just hit, I guess we'll call the low lights of these 10 verses. First thing we saw is that the psalm begins by crying out to God in prayer. Which is what we're supposed to do, right? A trial comes into your life, you cry out to God in prayer. He does. It all starts off very good, very authentic. And it's obvious, the second thing I see is that the psalmist is obviously in deep distress. And he sees no relief in sight. He's in deep distress. In fact, it says in verse 2, in the day of my trouble. That's a word that literally is the idea of what we would call today being in between a rock and a hard place. Feeling like the walls are collapsing in on him. And there doesn't seem to be any relief in sight. I stretch out my hands crying out to God without weariness, but my soul refuses to be comforted. There is no relief in sight. This is a terrible. Now, you know one thing I love, though? I love that the psalmist doesn't tell us exactly what the trouble was. I remember when I first was studying this going, well, what was Asaph's problem? What caused this? And I'm so glad he doesn't tell us, because if he told us what the problem was, we would focus more on the problem than we do his frustration. What is frustrating the psalmist? Well, obviously, he is frustrated by God's seeming inactivity. When I remember God, I am disturbed. Just the thought of you, God, makes my skin crawl. That's how frustrated he was with God. I've cried out, I've cried out, I've cried out, I've cried out, just like I'm supposed to do. But you haven't done your part. Have you been there? The psalmist even blames God for not being able to sleep. Blames God for not being able to speak. God, you're the one that holds my eyelids open. You won't even allow me to get rest. I can't even talk with anyone else because I am so in anguish, I can't even speak. And then the psalmist reflects back on the past when things were better, when it seemed like God loved him, when it seemed like God cared. And that just makes him feel worse. Because now the psalmist is going, why can't it be like it used to be, God? What made you change? Why can't you still hear my prayers like you used to? Remember when you used to hear my prayers and it brought me such joy? God, how come you're not doing that anymore? And even when he thinks back to the good old days, it just makes his frustration grow in intensity. So he asks those questions filled with theological inaccuracies. And my guess is if he was pouring out his heart to many Christians today, we'd have to stop him at every question to give him a theological discourse on why he was wrong. But God just listens. Because you'll never find a better listener than God. So he asks those penetrating questions. Lord, will you reject me forever? Will you never be favorable to me again? Has your loving kindness ceased in my life forever? Will you never keep another promise in my life? Have you forgotten me? Have you forgotten to be gracious to me? God, are you so angry with me that you'll never show me compassion again? Is that really what it's come down to? And then, in verse number 10, the psalmist concludes that God has changed, and his plight, because God has changed, is now to live the rest of his life in misery and grief. Now, those questions and that conclusion are all theologically incorrect. The problem is, in Asaph's heart, they seemed real. That was his perception. And perception to him was reality. Asaph has reached a point in his life. This worship singer in Old Testament temple worship, where he is now facing an enormous gap. Enormous gap. A gap between what he expected of God. I expected God to hear my prayer. I expected him to show me grace. I expected him to show me loving kindness. I expected him to show me compassion. I expected him to keep his promises. He's in a gap between what he expected of God and what he's actually experiencing. God hasn't done a blasted thing. He hasn't lifted one finger to help me. He hasn't done one thing to make my trouble go away. That's why he's frustrated. And if we're going to be honest, folks, let's be honest. We can all look at times in our life when we got frustrated with God because what we wanted God to do isn't what God did. That's frustrating. That's why you get frustrated with anybody, right? Why do you get frustrated with your kids? Because they're demons. Because they don't always do what you want them to do. Why do you get frustrated with your spouse? Because they don't always do what you want them to do. Why do you get frustrated with God? Because let's be honest, God doesn't always do what you want him to do. So here's the psalmist in this gap. A gap between what he expects of God and what he's experienced. Now, my friend, you and I face that gap on a regular basis. And can I suggest this to you? It is the gap moments of your life that are some of the most important moments you will ever face. And here's why. Because you will always fill the gap. Always. And what you fill the gap with will determine if that crisis, that trouble, that trial, those circumstances, that frustration will make you bitter the rest of your life, or God will use it to make you better. And it all comes down to what you fill that gap with. On one hand, you can fill that gap with bitterness. You can fill that gap with dismay. You can fill that gap with skepticism. Asaph is on the verge of landing there, isn't he? He's on the verge of landing there. Praise God, the psalm doesn't end after verse 10. He's on the verge of landing there. And when you fill that gap between what you expect of God and what you experience of God with doubt, cynicism, and skepticism, you will live the rest of your life in bitterness and misery. Or you can fill that gap with trust and faith, even though it's not the way you want it to be. Even though you don't understand. Even though you don't have answers to your questions. And if you will fill that gap between what you expect of God and what you experience with God, if you will fill that gap with faith, if you will fill that gap with trust, God will use that gap time in your life. God will use that trouble. God will use even your frustration to make you a better person. What you filled the gap with is a decision only you can make. Throughout the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, you will read stories of men and women who found themselves at a gap moment of their life. Some filled it with dismay and skepticism and became bitter. Others filled it with faith and trust and became better. There was one couple in the Old Testament that was standing in one of those gap moments. In a 24-hour period, they lost everything. All of their children were killed. They were very rich, and all of their possessions were taken away. And even the husband's health was so bad that he's sitting naked on the ground, covered with boils from head to foot, all on the same day. They were in that gap moment. And there's no doubt in my life that throughout that day, they cried out to God. But what they expected of God did not match what they experienced. And they faced the gap. The problem is they each filled it differently. Job's wife filled it with bitterness. And her words are seen in Job chapter 2, verse 9, when she looks at her husband and says, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? You're still trusting God after the day we've had? Just curse God and die." And she died a very bitter woman. But Job chose to fill that gap with faith and trust. And in chapter 13 and verse number 15, Job says, "Even if God takes my life, I will still put my hope in Him. I don't understand why He took my kids. I don't understand why He took my wealth. I don't understand why He's allowed me to be in this horrible physical situation. I don't know why He gave me such a gem of a wife. But I will still trust Him." You see, ladies and gentlemen, it is in the times of spiritual frustration that your trust in the Lord has the greatest opportunity to grow. Did you know that? It's in the times of your spiritual frustration that your trust in the Lord has the greatest potential to grow. Your trust doesn't grow when things are going great in your life. When things are going great in your life, you hardly need to trust. But when you face the gap between what you expected of God and what you experience of God, and you choose to trust God anyway, that's when your trust grows. My grandpa Disler was a childhood friend of Al Capone's. Remember the gangster Al Capone? But my grandpa ended up becoming a preacher. He was a preacher for 50 years. He pastored churches in Ohio, Illinois, New York, Fenton, Michigan. And then he ended his ministry as a superintendent at a rescue mission in Salinas, California. When my grandpa was dying of cancer and was down to his last few weeks, I flew out to California to say goodbye to him. And for the few days I was there, Grandpa pretty much was out of it, couldn't talk. But there was one afternoon, for about 2 hours, when God in His grace allowed Grandpa to be coherent. And I sat by his bedside. He gave me his Bible then, the one he used on the Navy ship he was on in World War II. He gave me a ring that I still wear today that a man in his first church made for him. And as we talked, he took my hand. He put it underneath his pajama top. And he said, "Scott, I want you to have an idea what I'm dealing with." And he led my hand from cancerous tumor to cancerous tumor to cancerous tumor to cancerous tumor. And very naive, I said, "Grandpa, do they hurt?" He said, "Oh, they hurt." And then my grandpa said this. He said, "Scott, for 50 years, I have preached Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And then he closed his eyes and quoted it. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight." And after he quoted it, he opened his eyes back up and said, "Scott, for 50 years, I've preached those verses. But for the first time in my life, I know what they mean." And then he gave me his final words I heard him say. When he said, "Scott, don't ever give up on the Lord. There will be times in your life when God seems distant. There will be times in your life when what you expect of God does not match what you experience. There will be times in your life when you're wondering in your heart, does He still love me? Does He still care? Has He forgotten about me? And when those times come, you fill that gap with trust. You fill that gap with faith. And no matter what, don't ever give up on the Lord. If Psalm 77 would have ended after verse 10, it would have been a travesty. But fortunately for you and me, there are still 10 more verses for us to study. We're going to study 5 of them next week. So I would like to end my sermon today by reading those 5 verses, just because I don't want us to end with verse 10. And I'm going to invite you at all of our campuses and locations. Would you stand with me, please? Here at the main auditorium, at the chapel, up at the Sioux campus, down at over on Bois Blanc Island, down at Tall Timber Church. If you're watching at home and you can stand, please do. Let me read where we'll go on next week. Because the first step of being honest with God isn't the only step. I love what happens next. In verse 11, the psalmist says this: I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your strength among the peoples. You have by your power redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Selah. Pause. Ponder. Because, my friend, you will never find a better listener than God is. Jeff's going to take over up at our Sioux campus. Jack down in our classic service right now. Here in the main auditorium, would you bow with me for prayer, please? And please know that if you are in that gap, every Sunday when the service ends, we have prayer team members that stand down front. They have lanyards on. They'd love to pray with you. Just walk up to one of them. Ask them to pray with you. They'd be glad to. And again, if you're a first-time guest, I hope you'll bring your card out to me in the hub. So, Father, I confess there are times in my life I get frustrated with you. But you already know that. But I'm thankful that I can be honest with you. I can share my raw, unfiltered feelings. Because I can never find a better listener than you are. So for those who are facing that gap right now, and all of us who will face that gap in the future, may we be honest with you. And may we fill that gap with faith and trust, so that your praise will forever be on our lips. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.